She found out her billionaire husband was having an affair, and the woman he betrayed her with wasn't just anyone. But instead of screaming or begging for answers, she smiled and planned the kind of revenge no one saw coming. A week later, she invited the woman's husband over for dinner and introduced him to her own husband. The room froze. Forks dropped. Secrets burned through the silence. The look on their faces, priceless. What happened after that dinner didn't just expose two cheaters, it destroyed their perfect little world forever. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty crown every woman with honor that never fades, peace that heals every wound, and a spirit so strong no storm can break it. You are the grace that holds the world together, the hands that build, the hearts that love, the souls that pray when all else falls silent. May every sunrise bring you blessings, every sunset wrap you in safety, and every moment remind you of your divine worth. But my precious family, why stay quiet when love needs your voice? One like, one comment, one heartbeat of support keeps this family alive. YouTube may try to silence us, but together we rise higher. This is Mission 1000 likes, our vow of love, faith, and unity. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. Melissa Hall had learned to read her husband's lies in the spaces between his words. But it was the photograph she found that taught her silence could be a weapon sharper than any scream. The clock downstairs chimed twice as Melissa stood motionless in Max Holt's private study, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. Sleep had abandoned her weeks ago, replaced by an instinct that whispered truths she didn't want to hear. The locked door had mocked her for months, until she'd found the spare key tucked behind a loose brick in the garden wall, placed there carelessly by a man who'd grown confident in his deceptions. The study smelled of leather and expensive cologne. The scent that used to comfort her now turned rancid with suspicion. She told herself she was being paranoid, that successful men kept private spaces, that marriages required trust. But trust was a house built on sand when the foundation kept shifting beneath your feet. The desk drawer opened with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. Beneath quarterly reports and legal documents, her fingers found the edge of something glossy. She pulled it free and her world tilted sideways. The photograph showed Max wrapped around a woman on a yacht, their bodies intertwined with the casual intimacy of lovers who'd forgotten to hide. The woman's head was thrown back in laughter, her hand resting possessively on his chest. Max's expression held something Melissa hadn't seen directed at her in years. Genuine joy, unguarded desire, the look of a man who'd found something he'd been searching for. Melissa's hands trembled as she studied the image, memorizing details like evidence for a trial she hadn't known she was preparing for. The woman wore diamonds that caught the sunlight, her beauty the polished kind that came from expensive maintenance. The yacht's name was visible in the background, Jameson Dream. She set the photograph on the desk and pulled out her phone, fingers moving with mechanical precision as she searched the name. The results populated quickly. Kyle Jameson, architect, designer of cultural buildings and private estates. His firm's website showed a man with kind eyes and careful hands, someone who built things meant to last. The charity section featured photographs from fundraising galas, and there she was, Kiki Horton, identified as Kyle Jameson's wife. Her smile bright and empty in every photo. Melissa sat in Max's chair, the leather still holding the impression of his body, and felt something inside her crystallize into diamond hardness. This wasn't a drunken mistake at a conference. This wasn't a moment of weakness. The photograph's metadata showed it was taken months ago. During a weekend, Max claimed he'd been overseas for meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. She thought about the distance that had grown between them, like frost spreading across glass. The way Max had started finding fault with everything she did, her cooking, her clothes, her laughter, her very existence in his space. She'd absorbed his criticism like a sponge, believing his dissatisfaction was something she'd caused, something she could fix if she just tried harder, became smaller, needed less. Now she understood. His withdrawal hadn't been about her failures. It had been about making room for someone else. Melissa photographed the picture with steady hands, then replaced everything exactly as she'd found it. She locked the study door and returned the key to its hiding place. When she slid back into bed beside her husband, his breathing remained deep and undisturbed. He'd never even known she was gone. In the darkness, she studied his profile, this man she'd loved for over a decade, and felt absolutely nothing. The grief would come later, she knew. But right now, in this moment, she felt only a cold clarity that burned away every soft edge she'd wrapped around herself to be the wife he wanted. She spent the early morning hours researching. Kiki Horton had been a model before marriage, now devoted her time to charity boards and social climbing. She had 2 sons, a historic home, a life carefully curated for envious admiration. Kyle Jamison's work spoke of integrity. Libraries, museums, community centers, buildings designed to serve rather than impress. His interviews revealed a man who believed architecture should honor human connection, who built with permanence in mind. By the time dawn filtered through the bedroom windows, Melissa had made her decision. She wouldn't scream, wouldn't throw the photograph in Max's face, wouldn't give him the satisfaction of her immediate devastation. She would do something far more deliberate, far more devastating. She would introduce Kyle Jamison to his wife's lover. Max stirred beside her, reaching across the bed with the automatic gesture of long habit. Melissa let him pull her close, pressed her cheek against his chest, and felt his heartbeat against her skin like a countdown to an ending he didn't know was coming. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," she replied, her tone perfectly normal, perfectly warm, perfectly false. He kissed the top of her head before rolling away to check his phone, already absorbed in his other life, the one where she didn't exist except as an obstacle to be managed. Melissa watched him scroll through messages, his expression flickering between concentration and something that might have been anticipation. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "about that conservatory I mentioned, the glass studio space for my painting." Max glanced up, clearly trying to remember a conversation he'd barely registered. "Right, yes. You wanted to commission someone?" "Kyle Jamison," Melissa said, letting the name land softly. "His firm specializes in light-focused designs. I reached out last week and he's interested in consulting." "Whatever you want," Max said, his attention already back on his phone. "Just handle it." "I will," Melissa promised. And the words carried weight he was too distracted to hear. She spent the morning in her existing studio, a converted bedroom that had never quite felt right, and began sketching. Her art had suffered during her marriage, constrained by Max's subtle disapproval of anything that took her attention from being available for his needs. Now her hand moved across the canvas, with anger translating into bold strokes, dark colors bleeding into each other like wounds opening. By afternoon, she'd composed an email to Kyle Jamison's firm, carefully professional, explaining her vision for a light-filled space dedicated to painting. She included photographs of the property, mentioned timeline flexibility, and signed it with the name Max had given her, Melissa Holt, a woman who'd lost her own name in the transaction of marriage. The response came within hours. Kyle Jamison himself offered to visit early the following week for an initial consultation. His message was warm but professional, excited about the creative possibilities, grateful for her interest in his work. Melissa read the email 3 times, then closed her laptop and returned to her painting. The canvas was taking shape now, showing the shadow of a figure dissolving into darkness while a door opened onto brilliant light. She didn't know yet what it meant, only that her hands were creating something true for the first time in years. That evening, Max came home late with apologies she no longer believed, with kisses she no longer felt. They ate dinner in comfortable silence, the kind that long marriages mistake for contentment when it's really just the quiet of two people living separate lives under the same roof. "How was your day?" he asked, fulfilling his quota of polite inquiry. "Productive," Melissa said, smiling across the table. "I commissioned that conservatory. The architect is coming next week." "That's great, sweetheart," Max replied, his eyes already distant, his mind already somewhere else, with someone else. Melissa nodded and took another bite, tasting nothing, feeling everything, and planning the most elegant revenge a betrayed wife had ever orchestrated. She would give him exactly what he wanted: permission to be himself, exposure without mercy, consequences delivered with surgical precision, because the opposite of love wasn't hate. It was clarity, and Melissa Hall had never seen more clearly in her entire life. The photograph remained hidden in Max's study, but its image was burned into her memory like a brand. Let him keep his secrets for now. Let him think he was clever, careful, safe in his deceptions. Soon enough, he would learn that the most dangerous woman in the world is one who's been underestimated for too long, who's absorbed every slight until she's become dense with understanding, who's learned that silence isn't weakness, but strategy. Melissa finished her wine and excused herself to bed early, claiming fatigue. Max barely looked up from his laptop, already lost in whatever message thread had captured his attention. She climbed the stairs alone and stood in the window of their bedroom, looking out at the estate that had never truly felt like home. Next week, Kyle Jameson would walk through her door, and the careful architecture of 4 lives would begin its collapse. She was ready. Chapter 2. The Blueprint of Pain. Kyle Jameson arrived exactly on time, which told Melissa everything she needed to know about the kind of man who'd married Kiki Horton. His car was practical rather than ostentatious, his handshake firm but not performative, his eyes the kind that actually saw what they were looking at instead of cataloging value. "Mrs. Holt," he greeted her, his smile genuine. "Thank you for considering our firm. Your property is stunning." "Please, call me Melissa," she said, leading him through the house toward the gardens where she envisioned the conservatory. "And thank you for coming personally. I know your time is valuable." "Buildings that matter require understanding the people who'll inhabit them," Kyle replied, pulling out a worn leather portfolio as they walked. "Tell me how you work. What does your creative process need?" The question surprised her. Max had never asked about her creative process, had never wondered what her art required beyond a room he didn't have to see. Melissa found herself answering honestly, describing her need for natural light, for space that felt both protected and open, for walls that wouldn't constrain but would shelter. Kyle listened with complete attention, occasionally sketching quick notes, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was building a structure in his mind as she spoke. They walked the property for over an hour, Kyle studying angles of sunlight, testing soil composition, considering sight lines and seasonal changes. "You're thinking about permanence," Melissa observed, watching him photograph the morning light filtering through the trees. "Always," Kyle agreed. "Buildings outlast us. They should be gifts to the future, not just solutions for the present." Something in his voice made Melissa pause. She heard the philosophy of someone who believed in lasting foundations, in commitments that transcended convenience. This was a man who built his life the way he built his structures, with intention, with integrity, with the expectation that what he created would endure. How had Kiki Horton looked at this man and chosen Max instead? "The conservatory should go here," Kyle said, indicating a clearing with perfect southern exposure. Glass walls on 3 sides, reinforced steel frame, thermal regulation for year-round use. We can install retractable panels for ventilation, incorporate your existing garden into the design rather than dominating it. As he sketched preliminary concepts, Melissa watched his hands move with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was building. His wedding ring caught the light with each motion, and she wondered if Kiki ever noticed the way her husband's hands created beauty meant to outlast them both. "Do you have children?" Melissa asked, keeping her voice casual. "2 sons," Kyle said, his entire expression softening. "They're the best parts of my life. Everything I build thinking about the world they'll inherit." "That's beautiful," Melissa said, and meant it. "Your wife must be proud of your work." Something flickered across Kyle's face, too quick to name. "Kiki has her own interests. She's very involved in charitable organizations, social advocacy. We each contribute in our own way." The careful neutrality of his response told Melissa volumes. This was a man who'd learned to answer questions about his marriage without actually saying anything true, who'd perfected the art of describing a partnership that existed more on paper than in practice. They spent another hour discussing structural possibilities, material choices, timeline considerations. Kyle's enthusiasm for the project was infectious, his vision transforming her vague desire for studio space into something architecturally significant. He promised to return with detailed proposals, initial renderings, cost estimates. "I really appreciate your time," Melissa said as they walked back toward his car. "This feels like the beginning of something important." "That's exactly what it should feel like," Kyle replied. "Good architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about creating spaces where transformation can happen, where people can become who they're meant to be." After he left, Melissa stood in the clearing where her conservatory would rise and felt the weight of what she was setting in motion. Kyle Jamieson was a good man, maybe even a great one. He didn't deserve what was coming. But then again, neither had she deserved Max's betrayal. And Kyle didn't deserve to live in ignorance while his wife destroyed their foundation stone by stone. Over the following weeks, Kyle returned multiple times. Each visit revealed more of who he was, the way he talked about his sons with unguarded affection, his belief that buildings should serve community needs before aesthetic trends, his admission that becoming an architect had been his response to watching beautiful things demolished unnecessarily. "My father raised a historic library when I was young," he told her during one afternoon consultation, his voice carrying old pain. "Said the land was worth more than the building. I watched them destroy something that had served generations so someone could build luxury condos nobody needed. I decided then that I'd spend my life creating instead of destroying, building things that would outlast profit margins." Melissa listened and felt the unfairness of it all settle deeper into her bones. This man, who built with permanence in mind, whose entire philosophy centered on enduring structures, had married a woman currently demolishing their life for momentary pleasure with someone else's husband. Their conversations evolved beyond the conservatory. Kyle asked about her art, studied her existing paintings with genuine interest, offered observations that revealed he understood the language of visual expression. Melissa found herself talking about her creative drought during her marriage, the way criticism had silenced her voice until she'd stopped trying to be heard. "Max doesn't appreciate your work," Kyle asked carefully, sensing the subtext beneath her words. "Max appreciates things that reflect well on him," Melissa replied, then immediately regretted the honesty. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." "No," Kyle said quietly. "That was real. And real is underrated in marriage." The admission hung between them, heavy with shared recognition. Here were two people trapped in marriages that had become performances, going through motions that no longer meant anything, staying for reasons that made less sense with each passing day. "Kiki and I," Kyle started, then stopped, shaking his head. "I shouldn't. You're my client." "You should," Melissa said gently. "Sometimes strangers are the only safe place to speak truth." Kyle looked at her for a long moment, deciding, "We've been distant for years. She's always been social, always needed attention I couldn't provide because I was working, building, trying to create the security she wanted. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being partners and became just two people managing a household together. I keep thinking we'll find our way back, but every year we drift further apart." Melissa recognized the same rationalization she'd been feeding herself, the belief that time and effort would repair fractures that were actually fundamental breaks. Kyle was a man who believed in fixing things, in the possibility of restoration. He would try to repair his marriage until the very moment it became undeniably unrepairable. That moment was coming soon. She would make sure of it. "I'm hosting a small gallery event next month," Melissa said, as Kyle prepared to leave after another consultation. "Would you and your wife like to attend? I'd love for you to see the kind of work I'm hoping to create in the new space." Kyle accepted the invitation with enthusiasm, promising to check Kiki's schedule. As he drove away, Melissa felt the pieces sliding into place. The trap was set with invitation instead of accusation, with social pleasantry instead of confrontation. Max came home that evening in a good mood, which meant he'd seen Kiki recently. Melissa recognized the signs now, the slight guilt-induced overcorrection of his behavior, the expensive flowers purchased to assuage conscience, the extra warmth that was really just relief that he'd gotten away with his deception again. "How's the conservatory project?" he asked over dinner, performing interest. "Wonderful," Melissa said, meeting his eyes with perfect composure. "Kyle Jameson is brilliant. You'll meet him soon. I've invited him and his wife to that gallery exhibition next month." She watched Max's face carefully, saw the micro-expression of panic quickly smoothed away. "That's nice," he managed. "What's his wife's name again?" "Kiki," Melissa said, letting the syllables linger. "Kiki Jameson. She's very active in charitable circles, apparently. Beautiful woman. I'm sure you'll find her interesting." Max reached for his wine glass, and Melissa saw his hand wasn't quite steady. Good. Let him start imagining scenarios, calculating risks, worrying about variables he couldn't control. "I'm sure they're lovely people," Max said neutrally. "They are," Melissa agreed. "Kyle especially. He's the kind of man who builds things meant to last forever. The kind who believes in permanence and integrity. The kind you don't meet very often anymore." The comparison was subtle, but landed exactly as intended. Max cleared his throat and changed the subject to something safe, something that didn't require him to examine what kind of man he'd become. That night, alone in her studio while Max worked late in his study, or pretended to, Melissa began a new painting. This one showed two houses on opposite sides of a chasm, beautiful and intact, but separated by a void neither could cross. She didn't know yet if it was about her marriage or Kyle's or both, only that her hands were finally speaking truths her mouth had been trained to swallow. The conservatory designs arrived via email the next day, and they were breathtaking. Kyle had created something that honored her needs, while elevating them into architectural significance. Every detail showed his careful attention, his commitment to creating space that would serve her creativity for decades to come. She approved the designs immediately, confirming the project's launch. The foundation work would begin soon, breaking ground on something new while everything else crumbled. Melissa forwarded the designs to Max with a brief note about the project timeline. His response came hours later, perfunctory approval with barely disguised disinterest. He had no idea he was authorizing the construction of his own undoing, that every beam and panel of glass would become part of the stage where his carefully maintained lies would finally shatter beyond repair. The gallery exhibition was scheduled for late autumn, giving Melissa time to prepare not just the event, but the precise orchestration of revelation. She would gather the four of them in one space, create unavoidable proximity between affair partners and betrayed spouses, and watch the performance crack under pressure until truth emerged like light through fractures. Kyle called that afternoon to thank her for approving the designs, his voice warm with professional satisfaction. They talked for an hour about materials and timelines, but underneath the practical conversation, Melissa heard something else. Two people discovering ease in each other's company, finding comfort in being genuinely seen. It complicated things, this growing friendship with the man whose life she was about to destroy. But complication was the nature of truth. Simple lies created complex damage. Complex truth created the possibility of simple healing, eventually, on the other side of devastation. "See you next month," Kyle said before hanging up. "I'm looking forward to seeing your work." "So am I," Melissa replied, and the double meaning resonated in her chest, like a bell announcing an ending neither of them fully understood yet. She stood at the window of her studio, watching the space where her conservatory would rise, and knew that some foundations had to be completely demolished before anything true could be built in their place. The demolition was coming. She would make sure it was thorough. Chapter 3. The Gallery of Truths. The gallery smelled of expensive perfume and wine, the air thick with the performance of cultural sophistication. Melissa had chosen the venue carefully, intimate enough to force proximity, public enough to constrain reactions, prestigious enough that declining the invitation would raise questions neither Max nor Kiki could afford. She'd arrived early to prepare the battlefield disguised as an art exhibition. The show was titled Fractures, featuring an emerging artist whose work consisted of photographing shattered glass in extreme magnification. Each image showed the precise moment of breaking, the patterns of destruction rendered beautiful through scale and light. Max arrived first, uncomfortable in his tailored suit, checking his phone compulsively. "This is impressive," he said, gesturing vaguely at the photographs. "Very conceptual." "It's about the beauty in breaking," Melissa explained. "About how destruction reveals truths that wholeness conceals." Max nodded without really hearing. Then the gallery door opened, and Kyle Jameson entered with his wife. Melissa watched Max's body language transform instantly, the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the too careful neutrality of his expression, the way his eyes found Kiki's face and then deliberately looked away. Beside him, Kiki had frozen mid-step, her smile brittle as spun sugar. "Kyle," Melissa called warmly. "I'm so glad you could make it. And this must be Kiki." She crossed to them with her hand extended, forcing Max to follow, engineering the first collision between her husband and his lover, while their spouses watched unknowingly. Kyle shook Max's hand with genuine warmth, talking about the conservatory project with enthusiasm. "Your wife has incredible vision," Kyle said. "You must be very proud," always Max managed, the word sounding strangled. His hand brushed Kiki's as they performed their greeting, the contact lasting a fraction too long. Kiki recovered with practiced skill, her beauty the kind that came from understanding how to weaponize appearance. She wore diamonds at her throat, a dress that cost more than most people earned in months. Her hand rested on Kyle's arm with possessive casualness, and her smile never wavered even as her eyes kept flicking toward Max. "Melissa has told me so much about your charitable work," Melissa said. "I try to give back," Kiki replied, her voice smooth as rehearsed lines. "Those of us with resources have responsibilities." The evening became a carefully choreographed dance. Melissa suggested Max and Kiki examine one photograph, while she and Kyle viewed another, creating forced proximity between the affair partners. Then she reversed the configurations, watching the subtle panic bloom on both guilty faces. "What do you think of this one?" Melissa asked Max, indicating a photograph showing glass at the moment of impact, spiderweb cracks radiating from a central point. "It's violent," Max said quietly. "It's honest," Melissa corrected. "Violence is often just clarity arriving uninvited." Across the room, Kyle was explaining structural engineering to his wife, drawing parallels between the glass fracture patterns and architectural stress points. Kiki nodded along, her attention clearly elsewhere, her body angled unconsciously toward where Max stood. "Shall we get champagne?" Melissa suggested, gathering all four of them toward the gallery's bar. She positioned them in a tight cluster, forcing conversation that required all four participants. "How did you two meet?" Melissa asked Kyle and Kiki. Kyle smiled, the memory still warm. "College. I was studying architecture, she was studying art history. We met in a class about Renaissance design. We both believed buildings should tell stories." "That's romantic," Melissa said. "Do you remember when you knew you'd marry her?" Kyle's expression grew softer. She was looking at plans for the Duomo in Florence, tracing the architectural lines with her finger, like she could feel the builder's intention. She said great architecture was really just love made visible, proof that someone cared enough to create beauty that would outlast them. "I proposed a year later. The story landed like a stone in still water." Kiki's face had gone pale, and even Max looked uncomfortable. "That's beautiful," Melissa said quietly. "Love made visible. What a gift to be seen that way. What about you two?" Kiki asked, deflecting. "How did you meet Max?" "Through mutual friends," Melissa replied smoothly. "I was painting. He was building his career. We both wanted something stable, something permanent. Or at least, I thought we did." The addition of that final sentence shifted the atmosphere immediately. Max's jaw tightened, and Melissa saw recognition dawn in Kiki's eyes. "Marriage is complicated," Kiki offered carefully. "Only when people complicate it," Melissa replied. "Seems to me marriage should be simple. You promise permanence, and then you honor that promise. The complication comes when people say one thing and do another." Kyle nodded agreement, missing the subtext. "Integrity and commitment. It's like structural engineering. You can't build on foundations you know are compromised. Everything collapses eventually." "Everything collapses eventually," Melissa repeated, looking directly at Max, "unless the foundation is reinforced with truth." They moved through the exhibition, Melissa orchestrating their movements like a director staging a play. She guided them to photographs of breaking glass, of fractures propagating through transparent surfaces, of destruction rendered beautiful through artistic interpretation. "The artist says these images are about betrayal," Melissa explained, "about how we don't see the cracks in our lives until they've spread beyond repair, about how impact happens in an instant, but the breaking takes much longer than we realize." Kyle studied the images with genuine interest. "Look at this one. You can see where the initial stress point occurred, but the damage radiated outward in patterns determined by the glass's existing weaknesses. The breaking reveals what was always there, but hidden." "Exactly," Melissa agreed. "We all have existing weaknesses. The question is whether we address them or wait for them to shatter everything." The evening stretched into hours of increasingly uncomfortable conversation. Max and Kiki maintained their charade with growing desperation, finding excuses to step away. Exchanging glances loaded with meaning Kyle remained oblivious to. Finally, as the gallery prepared to close, Melissa made her move. "This has been wonderful," she said warmly. "We should do it again. Max's family has a lake house upstate. Maybe we could all spend a weekend there. We could finalize the conservatory details, and Kyle, you could see the property where Max proposed." The suggestion landed like a bomb. Max's face went through several emotions before settling on forced enthusiasm. Kiki looked like she might physically flee, but Kyle accepted immediately, already envisioning architectural inspiration. "That sounds perfect," Kyle said. "When were you thinking?" "Soon," Melissa replied, her eyes locked on Max, "while the weather's still good. Maybe next month?" Max had no choice but to agree, trapped by social convention. Kiki managed a weak smile, her hand trembling as she lifted her champagne glass. They parted with promises to coordinate schedules. As Kyle helped his wife into their car, Melissa saw him kiss Kiki's temple with casual affection, saw the way she flinched almost imperceptibly. Max waited until they'd driven away before turning to Melissa, his expression somewhere between fury and panic. What the hell are you doing? Hosting a weekend for new friends, Melissa replied innocently. Is that a problem? You know it's a problem, Max hissed. You can't possibly think what? Melissa interrupted, her voice suddenly cold. That my husband might be uncomfortable spending a weekend with his architect and the architect's wife. Why would that be uncomfortable, Max? Is there something you need to tell me? He stared at her, understanding dawning that the dynamics had shifted. Melissa. The lake house weekend is happening, she said flatly. You'll attend, you'll be gracious, and you'll deal with whatever discomfort you feel. Consider it practice for all the discomfort I've been dealing with while you destroy our marriage. She walked away, leaving him standing alone in the gallery, surrounded by images of beautiful things breaking into irreparable pieces. The trap was set. The players were committed. Soon the weekend would arrive, and with it, the revelation that would shatter 4 lives with the precision of impact on already compromised glass. Chapter 4. The Lake House Unraveling. The lake house rose from the water's edge, like something from another era, all weathered wood and stone, windows reflecting morning light across water that looked cold, even in late autumn. Melissa had suggested they arrive separately, giving Max no opportunity to negotiate or retreat. No chance for whispered strategies with Kiki during the drive north. Kyle arrived first, his car packed with architectural drawings and a visible enthusiasm that made Melissa's chest ache with preemptive guilt. He emerged with a bottle of wine and that genuine smile that had no agenda beyond kindness. This place is incredible, he said, studying the house's construction with professional appreciation. The stonework alone is probably original to the property. They don't build like this anymore. Built to last, Melissa agreed, unlocking the door. Max's grandfather constructed it himself, said he wanted something that would survive generations, something his children's children would gather in. Kyle nodded, running his hand along the doorframe. That's the right way to think about home, not as a commodity, but as legacy. Max arrived shortly after, his jaw tight, his greetings strained. He unloaded bags with jerky movements that broadcast tension to anyone paying attention. But Kyle was absorbed in examining the house's structural elements, pointing out details Melissa had never noticed in all her years visiting this place. Kiki was the last to arrive, pulling up in a car too expensive for the rural roads, her sunglasses too large, her expression carefully blank. She emerged moving slowly, like someone approaching an execution they'd been anticipating for weeks. This is lovely, Kiki said, her voice professionally cheerful, her eyes avoiding Max completely. She hugged Melissa with the false warmth of women who'd been trained to weaponize friendliness, then turned to her husband. Kyle, you were right about the location. The light here is extraordinary. The first few hours passed in uncomfortable normalcy. They settled into rooms, prepared lunch together, engaged in the small talk that fills space when larger truths lurk beneath every sentence. Melissa had planned the sleeping arrangements deliberately. Her and Max in the main bedroom, Kyle and Kiki in the guest room directly across the hall. Close enough to hear conversations through old walls, close enough to ensure no privacy for clandestine communication. Should we walk the property before we lose the light? Melissa suggested after lunch. Kyle, you wanted to see the dock and boathouse for structural inspiration. They set out in pairs, Melissa with Kyle, Max with Kiki, the configuration unnatural enough to create immediate tension. Max looked physically ill, while Kiki moved like she was being marched towards sentencing. But Kyle remained oblivious, enthusing about timber construction and water-level engineering, while Melissa walked beside him and let him talk. Your husband seems stressed, Kyle observed as they neared the water. Everything okay? I don't know, Melissa said honestly. Would you tell me if Kiki was behaving strangely? Kyle hesitated, and in that pause, Melissa saw the hairline fractures he'd been ignoring for months. She's been distant. More than usual, I mean. We've been distant for years, but lately it's different. Like she's somewhere else, even when she's physically present. That sounds lonely, Melissa said quietly. It is, Kyle admitted, staring across the lake. I keep telling myself marriage has seasons, that we'll find our way back, but honestly, I don't know if she wants to be found anymore. Melissa wanted to tell him then, wanted to rip the truth into the open like tearing off a bandage, but timing mattered. The revelation had to be complete, undeniable, impossible to minimize or explain away. Behind them, Max and Kiki walked in loaded silence, maintaining careful distance. Two people terrified of being alone together, yet equally terrified of what their spouses might notice. Dinner that evening was excruciating. Melissa had cooked deliberately, forcing them all into the intimacy of shared meal preparation. The kitchen was too small for 4 people, creating constant proximity, unavoidable contact. She watched Max and Kiki orbit each other like magnets, drawn together, then repelling, their chemistry obvious to anyone who knew what to watch for. Kyle set the table with his usual care, folding napkins precisely, arranging silverware with architectural symmetry. He talked about his sons, about their upcoming school performances, about the community center design he was finalizing. His voice carried the enthusiasm of someone desperate to fill silence with anything that wasn't the truth, hovering just beneath the surface. Do your boys look like you or Kiki? Melissa asked, passing dishes around the table. Probably more Kiki, Kyle said. They got her bone structure, her coloring. I just gave them my tendency to overthink everything. They're beautiful children, Kiki added mechanically. Very smart, very athletic. The compliment sounded rehearsed, extracted without genuine warmth. Melissa saw Kyle notice, saw the small frown that suggested he'd heard this performance before. His wife speaking about their children like accomplishments she'd produced rather than people she'd created. Max and I never had children, Melissa said. The statement landing deliberately in the conversation's center. I wanted them, he kept saying later, when things were more stable, when the timing was right. Eventually I realized the timing would never be right because he didn't want them with me. Max's fork clattered against his plate. That's not fair, Melissa. We discussed this. We agreed. You agreed, Melissa interrupted calmly. I accommodated. There's a difference. The tension ratcheted up several degrees. Kiki shifted uncomfortably, her own guilt about her children suddenly present in the room. Kyle looked between his hosts with growing confusion, sensing currents he couldn't name. After dinner, they moved to the living room with wine, the fireplace casting shadows that made everyone's expressions difficult to read. Melissa had planned this too, the wine to loosen inhibitions, the semi-darkness to create false security, the comfortable furniture that encouraged people to settle in instead of escape. I want to tell you all a story, Melissa announced, setting her glass down deliberately. A hypothetical situation, just something I've been thinking about. Max tensed immediately, his entire body going rigid. Kiki's hand trembled as she lifted her wine glass. Imagine, Melissa continued, her voice conversational, a woman who discovers her husband is having an affair. Not a drunken mistake, not a momentary weakness, but a calculated, ongoing betrayal with another man's wife. Kyle laughed uncomfortably. That's dark for fireside stories. Let me finish, Melissa said gently. This woman, she doesn't scream or file for divorce immediately. Instead, she decides to do something different. She befriends the other woman's husband, creates a genuine connection with him, brings all 4 people together in a situation where the truth has to emerge because the proximity makes deception impossible. The silence that followed was absolute. Kyle had stopped smiling, his intelligence finally catching up to the subtext. Max had gone pale as paper. Kiki looked like she might vomit or run or both. Why would she do that? Kyle asked slowly, his voice changing texture. Because, Melissa said, pulling out her phone, exposure is sometimes the only path to truth, and truth is the only foundation worth rebuilding on. She opened her photo library and handed the phone to Kyle. On the screen was the yacht photograph. Max and Kiki wrapped around each other, undeniably intimate, irrefutably together. Kyle stared at the image for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. His face went through a series of transformations: confusion, recognition, comprehension, devastation, fury, before settling into something blank and unreachable. "When?" he asked, his voice barely functional. Kiki started crying immediately, reaching for him. "Kyle, please let me explain." "When?" he repeated louder, pulling away from her touch like it burned. 6 months, Melissa supplied quietly. "At least 6 months. Probably longer." Kyle turned to Max, still holding the phone displaying his wife's betrayal. "You came to my office. You looked at photographs of my sons. You smiled while discussing the conservatory I'm building for your wife. You shook my hand." Max stood, hands raised placatingly. "Listen, Kyle, it's not what you think." "Not what I think." Kyle's voice rose, months of ignored instinct crystallizing into rage. "You're holding my wife in this photograph. You're on a yacht I could never afford during a weekend. She told me she was at a spa retreat. What part am I misunderstanding?" "It was a mistake," Kiki sobbed. "It meant nothing. It's already over, I swear." "Don't," Kyle said, the single word cutting through her protests. "Don't insult me further by lying to my face right now. I want the truth. All of it. How long? How many times? Did you ever actually love me, or was I just convenient?" The questions poured out of him, each one an indictment. And Melissa watched a good man break in real time, watched 15 years of marriage disintegrate under the weight of questions that should never have needed asking. 2 years, Kiki finally admitted, her voice cracking. "It's been 2 years. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I never meant to hurt you." 2 years, Kyle repeated, the number seeming to hollow him out from the inside. "Our younger son's heart condition, when he was in the hospital last year, and I thought I was losing my mind with fear. Were you with Max then? When I needed you, when our child needed you, were you with him?" Kiki's silence was answer enough. Kyle made a sound like he'd been punched, standing abruptly, backing away from all of them. "I need to leave," he said, his voice distant, mechanical. "I need to not be in this room anymore." He walked out, the door closing behind him with controlled care rather than a slam, which somehow made it worse. They heard his car start, heard him drive away into the darkness, leaving 3 people sitting in the wreckage of what Melissa had detonated. Kiki turned on Melissa with sudden viciousness. "You did this. You planned this whole thing. You're a monster." "I'm a wife who was tired of being lied to," Melissa replied evenly. "You want to call me names because I revealed truths you were happy to hide? Fine, but own your choices, Kiki. Own what you did. I didn't create your affair. I just refused to let you hide it anymore." Max found his voice, finally, standing between the 2 women. "Melissa, we need to talk, privately." "No," Melissa said, standing as well. "We don't. Everything that needed saying has been said. You betrayed me. Repeatedly, deliberately. You made me feel like I was failing as a wife, when really you were just making room for someone else. And now it's over. We're done, Max. The marriage ends tonight. You can't just—" "I absolutely can," Melissa interrupted. "I've already retained an attorney. The papers will be filed this week. You'll hear from my lawyer about asset division, but honestly, keep it all. Keep this house, keep the money, keep whatever you bought with your lies. I don't want anything that carries your touch anymore." She walked out then, leaving Max and Kiki to face each other across the ruins of what they'd destroyed. 2 marriages, 2 families, 2 people who'd built their lives on the foundations they'd helped demolish. Melissa drove into the darkness after Kyle, following her instincts about where a hurt man might go. She found him sitting on the public boat dock, staring at water that reflected no light, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to protect something that had already been destroyed. "I'm sorry," Melissa said, sitting beside him carefully. "I know that doesn't help, but I'm sorry you had to find out this way." "Why didn't you just tell me?" Kyle asked. "Why the whole performance?" "Because if I told you privately, they would have denied it, minimized it, made you doubt what you knew to be true. This way, there's no ambiguity, no room for them to gaslight you into believing you misunderstood. The truth is undeniable. Kyle nodded slowly, understanding the logic even as he hated it. 2 years? I've been living a lie for 2 years while thinking we were just going through a rough patch. I'm an idiot. You're someone who trusted the person you married, Melissa corrected. That's not idiocy. That's integrity. You built your life expecting permanence because you offered permanence. Their betrayal doesn't make you wrong. It makes them liars. They sat in silence for a long time, two people who'd been betrayed by the people they'd promised themselves to, finding strange comfort in shared devastation. What happens now? Kyle finally asked. Now, Melissa said quietly, we survived this. We figure out who we are outside these marriages that were killing us. We help each other through the worst of it. And eventually we build something true. Kyle turned to look at her, really look at her, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman beneath the calculated revenge, the pain beneath the strategy, the grief beneath the strength. I don't know if I can do this, he admitted. You can, Melissa promised. We both can. Because the alternative is staying in relationships that were already dead, and we deserve more than haunting the graves of marriages that stopped being real a long time ago. She drove him back to the lake house to collect his things, waited while he packed in mechanical silence, ignored Kiki's pleading attempts at conversation. Max had disappeared, probably to his study to strategize how to minimize financial and reputational damage. As Kyle loaded his car, he paused beside Melissa's vehicle. Thank you, he said quietly. I know that sounds insane, thanking you for destroying my marriage. But you gave me the truth, and truth is the only thing worth having, even when it destroys everything else. Melissa nodded, understanding completely. Go home, be with your sons. They'll need you stable and present. Everything else we'll figure out. She watched him drive away, then returned to the lake house one final time. Max was waiting in the living room, his expression caught between anger and calculation. What do you want? He asked flatly. To punish me? To destroy me publicly? Name your price, Melissa. What will it cost to end this quietly? Melissa looked at him, this man she'd loved, this stranger she'd married, and felt absolutely nothing. I don't want anything from you, Max. Not your money, not your apologies, not your promises to change. I want a divorce, and I want to never have to think about you again. That's all. She left him standing there and drove back to the city alone, through darkness that felt less oppressive than the marriage she'd finally escaped. The lake house would stand for generations, just as Max's grandfather intended. But the people who'd gathered there that weekend would never be the same. And perhaps that was the real definition of permanence. Not structures that outlasted time, but truths that once spoken could never be unheard. Chapter 5. The Wreckage. Melissa returned to an empty house that felt larger without the pretense of marriage filling its rooms. Max hadn't come back. His lawyer called the next morning with clinical efficiency, discussing asset division like it was a business dissolution rather than the death of a shared life. She gave him the name of her own attorney and hung up before he could extend the conversation into something resembling personal exchange. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of necessary tasks and unexpected grief. She moved Max's belongings to the guest house, packed with methodical care that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with maintaining control through motion. Every suit she folded, every tie she rolled, felt like erasing evidence of a crime she'd finally stopped pretending hadn't been committed. Kyle called on the third day, his voice hoarse, like he'd spent nights screaming or crying or both. I told my sons, he said without preamble. Not the details, just that their mother and I are separating. My older boy asked if it was his fault. He's 11 years old, and he asked if he did something wrong. What did you tell him? Melissa asked, gripping the phone tighter. That adults sometimes break promises to each other, but never to their children. That I would always be their father, regardless of what happened between me and their mother. That love doesn't divide or diminish, it just transforms into different shapes. That was exactly right, Melissa said quietly. It feels like lying, Kyle admitted, because right now I don't feel capable of loving anyone. I feel carved out, like someone reached inside and removed everything vital and left just the mechanics of existing. Melissa understood completely. She'd been moving through her days, performing the motions of living while feeling fundamentally absent from her own life. Food tasted like nothing. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by waking gasps as her body remembered betrayal her mind had temporarily forgotten. Art felt impossible, her studio a space she couldn't enter without feeling Max's absence, like a phantom limb. "Want to have coffee?" she asked impulsively. Misery might enjoy company. They met at a cafe far from their neighborhoods, somewhere anonymous where no one knew them or their stories. Kyle looked hollowed out, shadows beneath his eyes speaking of sleepless nights. His clothes hanging slightly loose like he'd forgotten eating was necessary. Kiki moved back in with her parents temporarily, he told Melissa, as they sat with untouched coffee between them. She said she needed space to think, which is rich, considering she spent 2 years not thinking about consequences. Her mother called me, asked what I did to drive Kiki to someone else. People always blame the betrayed, Melissa observed. It's easier than acknowledging that some people just choose to hurt the ones who trust them. Max's friends have been calling, Kyle said. Apparently, he's been telling people you had an affair with me, that you seduced me to get back at him for some imagined slight. He's rewriting history in real time, making himself the victim of a vindictive wife instead of an unfaithful husband. Melissa laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. Of course he is. That's what people like them do. Reframe their choices as reactions to others' failures. We drove them to it by being insufficient somehow. They sat in silence for a while, two people learning the language of surviving something they'd never imagined they'd need to survive. Other cafe patrons laughed at adjacent tables, conducted business meetings, celebrated small joys, all of them moving through lives that hadn't recently exploded. I keep replaying moments, Kyle said eventually. Searching for signs I missed. There were so many. Late meetings that ran later than made sense. New lingerie I never saw. The way she started going to the gym religiously even though she'd always hated exercise. I told myself she was finding herself, or whatever middle-aged people are supposed to do, to feel vital again. Never occurred to me she was preparing herself for someone else. Max became critical, Melissa shared. Everything I did was wrong somehow. My cooking, my clothes, the way I laughed, the space I occupied. I thought I was failing at being a wife, when really he was just creating distance, so betrayal would feel justified. Make me inadequate enough, and cheating becomes reasonable response instead of character flaw. Did you love him? Kyle asked suddenly. When you married him, was it real? Melissa considered the question with honesty it deserved. I thought so, but looking back now, I wonder if I loved who I wanted him to be instead of who he actually was. I loved the stability he represented, the idea of partnership, the fantasy of building something permanent. But did I know him, really know him? I don't think so. And I don't think he knew me either, because if he had, he would have understood what he was destroying. I loved Kiki, Kyle said quietly. Maybe still do, which makes it worse. I loved who we were before she decided I wasn't enough. Loved the family we built, the life we designed together. Finding out it wasn't real for her feels like discovering everything I built my existence around was architectural illusion. Beautiful facade with no structural integrity. They finished their coffee and walked aimlessly through the city. Two ghosts among the living, finding strange comfort in being seen by someone who understood the specific texture of their grief. At a park, they sat on a bench and watched children play, their laughter sharp contrast to the silence stretching between two adults whose own childhoods felt impossibly distant. My attorney says the divorce will take months, Melissa said. Wants me to document everything for asset division. Every credit card statement, every suspicious charge, every piece of evidence of marital misconduct. It feels like being asked to autopsy a relationship that's already decomposed. Kiki wants to fight for the house, Kyle replied. The house I designed for her, that I built partially with my own hands, that I poured everything into creating. Her lawyer says she deserves it because she's the primary caregiver for our sons. Never mind that she used that house to plan her affair, that every room carries memories of a life that was a lie. Are you going to fight her? Melissa asked. Kyle shook his head slowly. What's the point? It's just a building. I can design another house, build other spaces. What I can't rebuild is the 15 years she took from me, believing we were building towards something together when she'd already decided I wasn't enough. His pain was so raw that Melissa felt it like her own, a shared wound that made isolation impossible. She reached for his hand without thinking, and he gripped it like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. I'm afraid, Kyle admitted. Afraid I'll never trust anyone again. Afraid I'll carry this damage into every relationship and sabotage anything good because I can't believe in permanence anymore. Afraid my sons will learn from this that love is conditional and promises our performance. I'm afraid too, Melissa confessed. Afraid that Max was right about me, that I'm somehow unlovable in ways I can't see. Afraid that I wasted my best years on someone who was counting days until he could leave. Afraid that this is all I get, one marriage to someone who never really wanted me, and then loneliness dressed up as independence. They sat with their shared fears as afternoon faded into evening, the park emptying around them until they were the only ones left. Two people holding hands against darkness that felt more internal than external. Want to get dinner? Kyle asked finally. Something better than coffee and confession. They found a restaurant that was too loud to talk deeply, ordered food neither of them was hungry for, and attempted normalcy like people trying on clothes that no longer fit. The effort was exhausting but necessary, practicing how to exist in public while privately shattered. Melissa picked at pasta, while Kyle mechanically consumed something he probably couldn't have described if asked. Around them, other diners celebrated anniversaries, conducted first dates, gathered for family dinners, all of them performing relationship rituals Melissa and Kyle had once believed in, before learning that rituals meant nothing if the participants were just acting. Thank you for this, Kyle said as they left the restaurant. For not leaving me alone with this. I know we barely know each other outside the context of our spouse's betrayal, but somehow you're the only person who understands. We're trauma-bonded, Melissa replied with dark humor. Not the healthiest foundation for friendship, but it's what we've got. They parted with tentative plans to meet again, two survivors recognizing they needed witnesses to their pain, who wouldn't offer empty platitudes or suggest they'd be better soon. The grief would take as long as it took, and anyone who couldn't sit with that reality wasn't useful company. At home, Melissa finally entered her studio and faced the blank canvas waiting there. She picked up a brush for the first time since the lake house and began painting without plan or concept, letting her hands speak truths her voice couldn't articulate. The image that emerged was abstract but undeniably violent, dark colors clashing, forms dissolving, suggestion of figures disintegrating into chaos. She painted through the night, stopping only when exhaustion made, holding the brush impossible. The completed work showed destruction without resolution, pain without healing, the raw truth of what betrayal looked like when stripped of narrative or justification. She titled it The Morning After and started another immediately, because now that her hands had remembered how to speak, they wouldn't stop, couldn't stop, needed to keep translating grief into something visible, something outside herself that proved the pain had been real, even if the marriage hadn't been. Kyle texted near dawn, "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about everything we didn't see or chose not to see. When does it stop hurting?" Melissa replied honestly, "Don't know. But maybe that's not the right question." Maybe we're supposed to hurt until the hurt transforms into something else. Maybe pain is just love being forced to acknowledge reality. That's devastatingly accurate, Kyle responded. Want to meet for breakfast? Melissa offered. Might as well be devastated together. Yes, Kyle agreed simply. They began meeting daily, coffee becoming breakfast, becoming lunch. Hours spent processing their respective divorces and the shared earthquake that had fractured 4 lives. People who saw them together probably assumed they were a couple. But the reality was more complicated. They were 2 people learning to exist outside marriages that had been killing them slowly, finding survival in witnessed grief. Kyle told her about his son's questions, his younger one asking if Daddy still loved Mommy, even though they couldn't live together anymore. He told her about explaining adult concepts to children who shouldn't need to understand betrayal, who should be protected from the knowledge that people who promise forever sometimes mean until convenient. Melissa shared the calls from mutual friends asking what happened. The Whisper network spreading Max's version, where she was unstable, and he was the victim of a woman's emotional breakdown. She told Kyle about the galleries that suddenly stopped returning her emails. The social invitations that dried up once taking sides became necessary. We're being erased from our own lives, Kyle observed one afternoon, as they walked through a museum he'd designed years before. Written out of narratives we were central to, replaced in histories we helped create. Then we'll write new ones, Melissa said firmly. Better ones. True ones, where we're not supporting characters in other people's stories, but the protagonists of our own. Kyle stopped walking and looked at her with something approaching hope. You really believe that's possible? I have to, Melissa replied. Because the alternative is accepting that betrayal gets to define us forever. And I refuse to give them that power. They stood in the museum's central atrium, light pouring through the skylight Kyle had designed to honor natural illumination, and made an unspoken pact. They would survive this, would help each other through the wreckage, would eventually build lives that mattered precisely because they'd been forced to rebuild from absolute destruction. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick, but it would be real, which was more than either of their marriages had been for longer than they'd known, and real, however painful, was infinitely preferable to comfortable lies. Chapter 6. The Slow Reconstruction. Winter arrived with the particular brutality that turns familiar landscapes strange. Melissa watched snow accumulate on the conservatory's exposed foundation, Kyle's design now frozen in mid-construction, waiting for spring to resume becoming what it was meant to be. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. The divorce proceedings had settled into grinding routine. Lawyers exchanged documents with clinical detachment, reducing years of shared life to spreadsheets of asset division. Max wanted the estate. Melissa didn't fight him for it, recognizing she'd never felt at home in rooms designed to impress rather than shelter. She took her studio equipment, her art collection, enough money to be comfortable without being dependent, and the satisfaction of knowing he would live in empty rooms that remembered her absence. Kyle's divorce proved more complicated. Kiki fought for primary custody despite her own infidelity, her lawyers arguing that the boys needed stability and continuity, code for punishing Kyle by using his children as weapons. The legal battles drained him financially and emotionally. Each hearing another excavation of failures neither side could claim moral superiority over. Her attorney asked me why I couldn't satisfy my wife, Kyle told Melissa, after a particularly brutal deposition. Asked if my focus on work constituted abandonment. Asked if perhaps I'd driven her to seek affection elsewhere through my emotional unavailability. They're trying to make you responsible for her choices, Melissa said, fury building on his behalf, reframing betrayal as reasonable response to your inadequacy. Maybe they're not wrong, Kyle replied, exhaustion making him vulnerable to doubt. Maybe I was absent. Maybe I did fail to see what she needed. No, Melissa said firmly. Adults communicate needs. They don't cheat and then blame their spouse for not reading minds. You may not have been a perfect husband, but you didn't cause her affair. She made that choice independently and repeatedly. Own whatever failures you had, but don't own hers. Kyle nodded but looked unconvinced. The erosion of self-worth, a predictable side effect of loving someone who decided you weren't enough. Melissa's art exhibition, titled Foundations, opened in February. The gallery, packed with people curious about the artist, whose marriage dissolution had provided excellent gossip. Critics praised the raw emotional honesty of her work, the way she'd transformed personal devastation into universal commentary on trust and betrayal. Kyle attended the opening, standing in front of a massive canvas titled The Moment Before, that showed architectural blueprints dissolving into watercolor chaos. This is how it felt, he said quietly, and Melissa knew he understood in ways the critics cataloging her technique never would. They left the gallery together, walking through cold that stung exposed skin, finding warmth only in motion and proximity. They talked about recovery, about whether they'd ever trust fully again, about the cost of choosing to stay open despite being broken. I'm dating, Kyle announced suddenly. My attorney suggested it might look good for custody, show I'm moving forward. Her name's Amanda. She's nice. Works with her hands doing restoration carpentry. That's great, Melissa said, meaning it despite the unexpected tightness in her chest. You deserve happiness. Do you want to know the pathetic part? Kyle continued. I spent the entire date comparing her to you, wishing I was sitting across from you instead, telling you about my sons instead of explaining them to a stranger who'll never really know them. Melissa stopped walking, turning to face him under a streetlight that made shadows of both their faces. Kyle, I know, he interrupted. I know it's too soon, that we're both damaged, that getting involved would be a disaster built on shared trauma. I know all the rational reasons this is a terrible idea, but when I'm with you, nothing else hurts as much. And I don't know if that's love or just the comfort of being understood, but I wanted you to know. Melissa stood in the cold, looking at this man who'd become her survival partner, and felt her own careful boundaries straining. I feel it too, she admitted. But we can't, not yet. Maybe not ever. We need to survive our divorces before we can even think about whatever this is. Kyle nodded, accepting the logic even as disappointment crossed his features. You're right. I just needed to say it out loud. To stop pretending. They walked the rest of the way to Melissa's new apartment, smaller than the estate, filled with her paintings and natural light. Space that was entirely hers, in silence that carried weight of words unspoken. Spring arrived slowly, winter reluctant to release its grip. The conservatory construction resumed, Kyle overseeing the work despite the personal discomfort of building something for Melissa he couldn't claim any part of beyond professional. They maintained careful boundaries, meeting only for project updates, avoiding topics that might stray into territory neither was ready to explore. But professional distance became impossible to maintain. One afternoon, discussing material choices in the half-finished structure, their hands touched while examining samples and neither pulled away. They stood frozen in the moment, months of careful control, threatening to collapse under the weight of proximity and longing. We should talk about this, Kyle said, his voice unsteady. If we talk about it, we'll do something stupid, Melissa replied. And I can't survive being broken again so soon, after barely surviving being broken the first time. What if it's not stupid? Kyle asked. What if it's real? How would we know? Melissa countered. How do we separate genuine connection from the fact that we're the only people who truly understand each other's specific pain? Maybe we're just using each other as emotional crutches while learning to walk again. Kyle stepped back, processing her words. You're right. We need time to heal separately before we can be anything together. They agreed to minimal contact to let the contractors finish the conservatory while they each focused on rebuilding individual lives. The separation was necessary but excruciating, like learning to walk after injury when every step reminded you of what you'd lost. Melissa threw herself into art, creating a series, exploring isolation and independence. She dated occasionally, coffee with a gallery owner who bored her within minutes, dinner with an art collector whose interest felt transactional. None of them made her feel less alone. Kyle called one evening, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I need to tell you something." "What happened?" Melissa asked, immediately alert. The custody evaluation came back. The psychologist noted concerns about Kiki's emotional stability, her tendency to prioritize image over substance. "They're recommending equal custody, true 50-50 split. I'm going to have my sons half the time instead of every other weekend." "Kyle, that's wonderful," Melissa said, genuine joy flooding through her. "It is," Kyle agreed. "But the evaluator also asked about you. Wanted to know about our relationship, whether you're a stabilizing influence or complicating factor. And I realized while answering that I couldn't describe what you are to me in any terms that made sense." "What did you tell them?" Melissa asked quietly. "The truth, that you're the person who showed me I was being betrayed, but also showed me I could survive being betrayed. That you're someone I trust in ways I didn't know were still possible after Kiki. That I'm falling in love with you, even though I know I shouldn't be. Even though the timing is catastrophic, even though we're both too damaged to handle what that means." Melissa closed her eyes, hearing her own feelings articulated in Kyle's voice. "You told the custody evaluator you're in love with me?" "No," Kyle said. "I told them you were a friend providing support during a difficult transition. But I'm telling you the truth now, because keeping it inside is killing me. I love you, Melissa. Not because you saved me or because we survived something together, but because of who you are when we're together. The way you see the world, the way you refuse to let betrayal make you smaller, the way you laugh at dark humor that should probably horrify you." "Kyle," Melissa started, her voice breaking. "You don't have to say anything back," Kyle interrupted. "I just needed you to know, needed to stop pretending this is just friendship or shared trauma. You've become essential to me in ways that have nothing to do with our ex-spouses and everything to do with who we are together." Melissa sat in her apartment, phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face because someone had finally seen her, really seen her, and loved what they found. "I love you too," she whispered. "And that terrifies me more than betrayal ever did, because I trusted Max, and look what happened. How do I trust this?" "Trust you?" "Trust myself to recognize real love instead of fantasy." "You don't," Kyle said simply. "You can't. Trust isn't something we're capable of right now. But maybe we can start with honesty, with showing up consistently, with building something slowly instead of falling into it desperately." "What does that look like?" Melissa asked. "I don't know," Kyle admitted, "but I know I want to find out. With you, if you're willing." Melissa thought about safety, about protecting herself from further damage, about all the rational reasons this was premature and potentially destructive. Then she thought about Kyle's hands, building beauty meant to last, about his honesty when dishonesty would have been easier, about the way he made her feel seen in ways Max never had. "I'm willing," she said finally, "but slowly, carefully, with both of us committed to complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." "Especially when it's uncomfortable," Kyle agreed. They started dating, though dating felt inadequate to describe what they were building. They had dinners where they discussed their divorces without romance, saw movies that made them cry or laugh without needing to hide either response, took long walks where silence felt comfortable instead of loaded. Kyle's sons met Melissa during a supervised introduction. both boys wary but curious about the woman their father talked about. She didn't try to mother them, didn't compete with Kiki, just showed up as herself, an artist who liked the same video games they did, who could explain color theory in ways that made sense, who treated them like people rather than obligations. "You're different than Mom," Kyle's older son observed during their third meeting. "How so?" Melissa asked carefully. "You laugh more, and you look at Dad like you actually like him instead of being stuck with him." The observation was devastating in its childlike clarity. Melissa met Kyle's eyes across the room and saw the same pain she felt. These children had been watching their mother's disinterest for years, learning that marriage was performance rather than partnership. "I do like your dad," Melissa said honestly. "Very much. But I'm not trying to replace your mom." "You already have a mom. I'm just someone who cares about you because I care about your dad." The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied with the honesty. His younger brother, less verbal but equally perceptive, simply took Melissa's hand and showed her his latest drawing, a house with too many windows, rooms filled with light, people inside who looked happy. "This is beautiful," Melissa said, studying the child's work. "Will you tell me about it?" "It's my new house," he explained. "The one I want Dad to build when we're all done being sad. It has space for everyone and light in all the rooms, so nobody has to hide." Melissa felt her chest constrict, recognizing in this 8-year-old's drawing the same desire for transparency she'd been chasing, the need for lives lived in light instead of shadow, for relationships that didn't require hiding. "Your dad should definitely build this," she agreed. "It's perfect." That night, after the boys had returned to Kiki's, Kyle held Melissa in his apartment and asked the question neither had been brave enough to voice. "Can we do this? Can we build something real after everything we've been through?" Melissa thought about it honestly. "I don't know, but I know I'd rather try and fail with you than succeed at staying safe and alone." "That's not exactly a romance novel declaration," Kyle observed with dark humor. "Good," Melissa replied. "Romance novels are fantasy. They want real, even if real is complicated and scared and uncertain." Kyle kissed her then, and it felt nothing like kissing Max had felt, not performative or strategic, just honest connection between two people who'd learned the hard way that anything worth building required foundation of truth rather than fantasy. The conservatory finished that spring, glass walls reflecting sunlight in patterns Kyle had designed specifically for Melissa's painting needs. They christened it together, Melissa setting up her easel while Kyle sat on the floor watching her work. Both of them understanding this space was more than building. It was proof that destruction could lead to creation, that endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to build on truth instead of ruins. "What are you working on?" Kyle asked as Melissa's brush moved across fresh canvas. "I don't know yet," Melissa admitted. "Something about light after darkness, about how we learn to see clearly only after illusions shatter, about two people finding each other in wreckage and building something that survives." "That's a lot for one painting," Kyle observed. "Then I'll make it a series," Melissa replied, smiling despite everything, because Kyle was here and she was creating again, and the conservatory's light made everything visible, which was terrifying and healing in exactly the measures she needed. They built their relationship in that space, slowly, carefully, with the kind of attention Kyle brought to architecture and Melissa brought to art. It wasn't easy. Damage doesn't heal neatly, but it was real, and real had become the only thing either of them valued anymore. Some foundations had to be completely destroyed before anything true could be built in their place. They'd both learned that truth. Now they were learning whether they could build on it together. Chapter 7. The Custody War. The morning Kyle was scheduled for his custody hearing, Melissa woke to find him sitting at her kitchen table, untouched coffee cold in front of him, staring at nothing. She'd learned to recognize this particular emptiness, the look of someone bracing for impact they couldn't avoid. "Talk to me," Melissa said, sitting across from him, not touching but present. What if they take my sons? Kyle asked, his voice hollow. What if the judge believes Kiki's lawyers that I'm unstable, that you're a destabilizing influence, that my children would be better off with her as primary custodian despite everything she's done? Then we'll appeal, Melissa said firmly. We'll fight until there's nothing left to fight with. Your sons love you. The evaluator's report supports equal custody. You've done everything right. Have I? Kyle countered. I'm in a relationship with the woman who orchestrated my wife's exposure. Kiki's attorneys are painting you as a homewrecker despite the timeline proving otherwise. They're making this about you instead of about her affair. And it's working because people always blame the person who revealed truth instead of the people who created lies. Melissa felt the familiar shame flood through her, the guilt she'd been carrying since the lake house. I'll testify. I'll explain exactly what happened, why I did it that way. I'll make them understand. No, Kyle interrupted. That's exactly what they want. You on the stand, having to defend revealing an affair, giving them the opportunity to paint you as calculating and vindictive. We can't give them that ammunition. The hearing was scheduled for mid-morning. Kyle's lawyer was competent but overwhelmed, facing Kiki's team of aggressive attorneys funded by her wealthy parents who viewed their daughter's custody battle as reputational warfare. They'd subpoenaed everything. Emails between Kyle and Melissa from the months following the lake house, text messages offering emotional support, photographs of them together at restaurants and galleries. They're presenting our friendship as evidence of an affair that predated your separation, Kyle's lawyer explained before they entered the courtroom, arguing that you were so entangled with Melissa that you neglected your wife, essentially driving her to max. That's insane, Melissa said, fury building. Kyle was faithful throughout his marriage. I was faithful throughout mine. We found each other after betrayal, not during. Truth matters less than narrative, the lawyer replied grimly. And they've constructed a narrative that makes you both culpable. The hearing was brutal. Kiki took the stand in carefully chosen clothes that suggested maternal devotion, crying at strategic moments while describing Kyle's emotional distance, his focus on work over family, his friendship with Melissa that felt like emotional infidelity, even if it wasn't sexual. I made a terrible mistake, Kiki testified, her voice breaking beautifully. I betrayed my husband and I'll regret it forever. But that mistake happened because I was desperate for connection Kyle couldn't provide. I'm not excusing my behavior, but context matters. I was lonely, and Max made me feel seen. Kyle's hands clenched into fists, and Melissa saw him physically restraining himself from calling out the performance they were witnessing. His lawyer cross-examined, establishing that Kiki's affair lasted years, that it required sustained deception, that loneliness didn't excuse betrayal. But the damage was done. Kiki had positioned herself as someone who'd made an understandable mistake, while Kyle remained the cold workaholic who'd driven his wife away. When Kyle took the stand, Kiki's attorneys circled like predators. They presented emails where Kyle told Melissa he loved her, texts where he admitted falling for her, photographs of them together that suggested intimacy their actual timeline didn't support. Mr. Jameson, when did your romantic relationship with Ms. Hall begin? The lead attorney asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer was damning. After my separation, Kyle said firmly. After discovering my wife's affair, after moving out of our home. Melissa and I were friends first, supporting each other through parallel divorces. How convenient, the attorney replied. Two betrayed spouses finding comfort in each other. Did you not consider how your new relationship might impact your children? My children's mother had an affair for 2 years, Kyle said, his voice rising. She used time meant for family to betray our marriage repeatedly. My friendship with Melissa, which became more over time, has nothing to do with my ability to parent. But Ms. Hall orchestrated your wife's exposure in a calculated manner, the attorney pressed. She manipulated you into confronting your wife at a lake house, creating maximum drama and trauma. Does that seem like someone with your children's best interests at heart? Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but his lawyer objected before he could speak. The judge sustained it, but the implication hung in the air. Melissa had manipulated everything, including Kyle, and therefore shouldn't be anywhere near his children. During lunch recess, "I'll pace the courthouse hallway like a caged animal." "They're winning," he said, panic edging into his voice. "They're making Kiki look like a sympathetic figure who made one mistake, while I'm the cold husband who immediately replaced her with the woman who destroyed our marriage." "That's not what happened," Melissa insisted. The truth doesn't matter," Kyle shouted, then immediately apologized. I'm sorry, I can't lose my sons, Melissa. I can't." She pulled him into an embrace he collapsed into, and they stood in the hallway while other people's legal battles continued around them. Two people learning that surviving betrayal was only the beginning of costs they'd be paying indefinitely. The afternoon session brought the custody evaluator's testimony. She explained her assessment carefully. Both parents loved their children, both were capable caregivers, but Kiki's affair and the emotional instability it suggested raised concerns about her judgment. She recommended true 50-50 custody, ensuring both boys maintained strong relationships with both parents. Kiki's attorneys attacked the evaluation immediately, pointing out that the evaluator had expressed concerns about Melissa's influence, about whether Kyle's new relationship might destabilize the children's adjustment to divorce. They presented expert testimony from a child psychologist arguing that children needed consistency, that shared custody created unnecessary disruption, that primary maternal custody was developmentally optimal. Kyle's lawyer countered with research supporting equal parenting time, with Kyle's documented involvement in his sons' lives, with evidence that he attended every school event, every doctor's appointment, every parent-teacher conference. But the hearing's momentum had shifted toward Kiki, her performance of maternal devotion and victimhood proving more compelling than Kyle's quieter demonstration of consistent presence. The judge announced she would take the matter under advisement, issuing a ruling within 2 weeks. Kyle left the courtroom looking defeated, and Melissa felt crushing guilt that her method of revealing the affair had provided Kiki's lawyers exactly the ammunition they needed to paint Kyle as the unstable parent. "I'm so sorry," Melissa said in the parking lot. "If I'd just told you privately instead of the lake house confrontation—" "Stop," Kyle interrupted. "You gave me truth when I needed it. Kiki's lawyers are manipulating that truth, but that doesn't make the truth wrong. It makes them good at their jobs and terrible at ethics." But Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that her need for revenge had inadvertently given Kiki power over Kyle's relationship with his sons. That evening she couldn't paint, couldn't focus, could only pace her apartment replaying the hearing's worst moments. Kyle's older son called that night, his voice small and scared. "Dad, Mom's lawyer asked me questions about Melissa. Asked if you spend more time with her than with us." I didn't know what to say. Kyle's face went white. "What did you tell him, buddy?" "I said you spend a lot of time with us. That Melissa is nice to us. That Mom seems sad all the time, but you seem less sad now. Was that wrong?" "No," Kyle said, his voice cracking. "That was perfect. That was honest. You did exactly right." After the call ended, Kyle sat with his head in his hands. "They're using my children as witnesses in a custody battle, making them choose sides, making them feel responsible for adult decisions." "This is my fault," Melissa said, guilt choking her. "I created the situation they're exploiting." "No," Kyle said firmly. "Kiki created this situation by cheating. Her lawyers are exploiting it, but you didn't cause it. Stop taking responsibility for other people's choices." The ruling came down a week later, primary custody to Kiki, with Kyle getting alternating weekends and 1 evening per week. The judge cited concerns about instability, about Kyle's new relationship developing too quickly after separation, about the need for consistency during the children's adjustment period. They could revisit the arrangement in 6 months. Kyle read the ruling 3 times before the words penetrated. Then he walked out of his lawyer's office and got in his car and drove nowhere in particular, just needing motion to prevent complete collapse. Melissa found him hours later, sitting in the conservatory, surrounded by glass and light, looking more broken than she'd ever seen him. "I lost them," he said simply. "I get 4 days a month with my sons because their mother had an affair, and I fell in love with you." The accusation wasn't intentional, but Melissa felt it land anyway. "Kyle, I'm sorry," he said immediately. "That's not fair. This isn't your fault. It's the system's fault. It's Kiki's lawyer's fault. It's the judge's fault for believing performance over substance. It's not your fault." But Melissa wondered if it was, at least partially. If her need to orchestrate dramatic revelation, rather than simply telling Kyle the truth, had created this cascade of consequences neither of them could control. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Kyle admitted. "I want to fight, but fighting means more lawyers and more money I don't have and more trauma for my sons. I want to walk away from you to prove I'm putting them first, but that feels like letting Kiki win, letting her betrayal dictate my entire life. I'm trapped between choices that all hurt people I love." They sat in the conservatory as afternoon faded to evening. 2 people learning that surviving betrayal was simple compared to surviving the aftermath of surviving. The way consequences rippled outward indefinitely, touching everything, destroying what hadn't already been destroyed. "I'll step back," Melissa offered. "If being with me is costing you your children, I'll step back. We can wait until the custody arrangement is reassessed, until the situation stabilizes." "No," Kyle said. "If I let fear of what Kiki might do control my life, I'm just trading one prison for another. I love you. I love my sons. Those loves don't negate each other. I refuse to accept that being happy with you means failing as a father." But the judge made a decision based on incomplete information and legal manipulation. Kyle interrupted. "That decision stands for now, but it doesn't define reality. Reality is that I'm a good father, you're a good person, and we deserve happiness even if it's complicated and scary and apparently legally disadvantageous." Melissa wanted to believe him, but guilt had teeth that wouldn't release. She'd set out to reveal truth and deliver consequences, but she hadn't anticipated that some consequences would fall on people who didn't deserve them, on Kyle's sons, on Kyle himself, on the possibility of building something real from the wreckage. "I never meant to hurt your children," she whispered. "I know," Kyle replied, "but hurt happens anyway, doesn't it? We do our best, act with integrity, try to minimize damage, and still people get hurt because we're human and complicated and living in a world where every choice has costs we can't predict." They held each other in the space. Kyle had built for Melissa's creativity, surrounded by glass that revealed everything, no shadows to hide in, and tried to find comfort in honesty, even when honesty offered no answers. The custody battle had been lost, but the war for Kyle's relationship with his sons would continue for months, maybe years, and Melissa would stand beside him through it, even though part of her wondered if stepping away would be the kindest gift she could give him. But Kyle had asked her to stay, so she would stay and they would survive this too, the way they'd survived everything else, together, damaged, honest, and stubbornly committed to building something real, even when reality kept demanding increasingly devastating prices. Chapter 8. The Price of Truth. Winter settled in again, as if the season had been waiting for maximum emotional devastation before making its return. Melissa's exhibition had closed, her paintings sold to collectors who would hang them in spaces she'd never see. Max's divorce papers arrived with clinical finality. He'd remarried already, a woman 20 years younger who worked in finance, someone who looked good on his arm and asked no difficult questions. Melissa saw the wedding announcement on social media and felt nothing, which was its own kind of healing. Kyle's situation proved less conclusive. The custody arrangement ground him down systematically, alternating weekends that barely gave him time to reconnect with his sons before they left again. Midweek dinners too short to do anything except maintain minimal connection. His older son had grown distant, parroting Kiki's narrative that Dad had left them for someone else. He asked me why I loved you more than I loved him, Kyle told Melissa one evening, his voice hollow. My own son thinks my capacity for love divides instead of multiplies. Thinks choosing you means unchoosing him. What did you tell him? Melissa asked. That love doesn't work that way, that I have enough love for everyone important to me, that choosing happiness with you doesn't diminish my love for him. Kyle paused, rubbing his face tiredly. Then he asked if I was happy when I was married to his mom, and I froze, because how do you tell your child that you were miserable for years without making them feel like the product of misery? The conversations with Kyle's sons became minefields where every truth threatened to detonate something precious. The 8-year-old adapted better, his younger resilience allowing him to accept that sometimes adults made choices that hurt but weren't intentionally cruel. The 11-year-old clung to anger like a life preserver, needing someone to blame for his family's disintegration. Melissa stayed carefully peripheral during Kyle's parenting time, not wanting to give ammunition to Kiki's inevitable custody reassessment. She met the boys for brief, supervised interactions, always in public spaces, always with Kyle present. The older boy treated her with studied indifference. The younger one occasionally warmed to her, forgetting his loyalty conflicts long enough to share drawings or ask about her paintings. Am I making everything worse? Melissa asked Kyle after a particularly strained dinner. Would your relationship with your sons be better if I wasn't in the picture? Kyle considered the question with honesty. Maybe, in the short term, but long term, I want them to see what real partnership looks like. If I walk away from you to appease Kiki or ease immediate tension, what does that teach them about commitment? It teaches them you put them first, Melissa replied. It teaches them love is conditional and temporary, Kyle countered. That you abandon people when circumstances get difficult. I don't want them learning that. The logic made sense, but didn't ease the guilt. Melissa had set out to reveal truth and deliver consequences. But she'd never imagined those consequences would include watching children she was growing to care about hate her for existing. Kiki's reappearance in Melissa's life came unexpectedly. She showed up at the conservatory one afternoon, her appearance careful. Expensive coat, manicured nails, the armor of someone trying to project control they didn't feel. We need to talk, Kiki announced, not waiting for invitation before entering. Melissa set down her paintbrush slowly. I'm listening. You destroyed my life, Kiki said with surprising calm. You orchestrated that entire lake house weekend specifically to humiliate me and Max, to blow up both our marriages publicly and irrevocably. I revealed the truth about an affair that was destroying 4 lives, Melissa corrected. You and Max destroyed your own marriages through sustained deception. I just refused to let you keep hiding it. You could have told us privately, Kiki argued. Instead, you turned it into a theatrical production designed to cause maximum damage. Melissa felt old anger resurface. Private confrontation would have given you time to craft lies, to minimize and manipulate. This way, the truth was undeniable. You got exposed, and yes, it was humiliating. But you earned that humiliation through years of betrayal. Kiki's composure cracked slightly. I'm losing my sons. Kyle's fighting for custody modification, and his lawyer is using my affair as proof of moral unfitness. My boys are learning their mother is a cheater. They're going to grow up ashamed of me because you decided to be judge and executioner. Your boys are learning you made choices with consequences, Melissa said flatly. That's not my fault. That's yours. You chose to have an affair. You chose to lie repeatedly. You chose to risk your marriage and family. Own your choices, Kiki. I'm trying to, Kiki shouted suddenly, her control shattering. I'm trying to own it, to be better, to repair what I can. But you made that impossible by ensuring everyone knows, by creating a scandal that follows me everywhere. Melissa felt unexpected sympathy pierce through her anger. Then rebuild publicly. Show your sons you made mistakes, but you're addressing them, getting therapy, becoming more honest. Stop making me the villain in your story when I was just another victim of your affair. You're not a victim anymore, Kiki said bitterly. You're with Kyle now. You got your revenge, and the man who should have been mine should have been yours, Melissa repeated incredulously. Kyle was your husband. He was yours for 15 years. You threw him away for Max, and now you're angry that he found someone who actually values him. Kiki's face contorted with something between grief and rage. I didn't mean to fall in love with Max. It just happened. Nothing just happens, Melissa said tiredly. You made 1,000 small choices that added up to betrayal. Stop pretending you're a victim of circumstance. They stood in the conservatory's light, two women whose lives had been irrevocably intertwined by betrayal and revenge, neither willing to yield ground. What do you want from me? Melissa finally asked. I want you to tell Kyle's lawyer that the lake house confrontation was manipulative, that you used Kyle as a weapon against me, Kiki said. I want you to give me back some credibility with my sons. No, Melissa said simply. Why not? Because it would be a lie, Melissa replied. The lake house was strategic, yes, but not manipulative. Kyle deserved to know the truth, and my relationship with him has nothing to do with you or Max. It's about two people finding each other after surviving devastation. I won't sabotage that to ease your guilt. Kiki stared at her for a long moment, then laughed bitterly. You know what the worst part is? I actually like you. If circumstances were different, we'd probably be friends. You're smart and honest, and you don't take shit from anyone. All the qualities I wish I had. You could have them, Melissa said. Choose honesty going forward. Stop hiding behind victimhood. Be the mother your sons need. Kiki left without resolution, and Melissa returned to her painting, but the encounter haunted her. She'd been so focused on delivering consequences that she hadn't considered what happened after consequences landed, the way damage rippled outward indefinitely. That evening, she told Kyle about Kiki's visit. He listened with growing frustration, then said, She's trying to manipulate you into sabotaging yourself. Don't let her. I think part of her actually meant it, Melissa said. About wanting to be better. She's had a year to be better, Kyle replied. She's chosen to fight for custody, using our sons as weapons, instead of acknowledging what she destroyed. I'm glad she wants to change, but wanting isn't the same as doing. Melissa nodded, recognizing truth in his words. But she also recognized that Kiki was living with consequences Melissa had engineered, and while those consequences might have been earned, they were still devastating. The custody modification hearing was scheduled for early spring. Kyle's lawyer prepared meticulously, documenting every interaction with his sons, every missed opportunity Kiki created, every way the current arrangement failed to serve the boys' needs. This time will be different, Kyle said, with determination he didn't quite feel. We have more evidence now, better witnesses. Melissa wanted to believe him, but she'd learned that family court was less about evidence than narrative. The night before the hearing, Kyle couldn't sleep. He paced Melissa's apartment, cycling through worst-case scenarios. What if this doesn't work? Kyle asked. What if the judge decides I'm still the unstable parent and reduces my time even more? Then we'll keep fighting, Melissa said. We'll keep showing up, keep being honest, keep demonstrating that we're the stable ones. Kyle pulled her close, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting. I don't know how to thank you for standing by me through this. You don't need to thank me, Melissa replied. You do the same for me. They held each other through the long night. Two people who'd survived betrayal, now surviving the endless aftermath, learning that some battles never truly end. They just transform into different shapes. Some prices were worth paying. They both believed that, even when the costs kept increasing beyond what they'd imagined they could afford. Chapter 9. The Emergency That Changes Everything. The call came during dinner on an ordinary Tuesday, Kyle's phone vibrating against the table with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Jameson, this is County General Hospital. Your son was brought in by ambulance. You need to come immediately." Kyle's face drained of color. Melissa stood before he finished the call, already grabbing car keys, already moving. "Which son?" Kyle managed to ask. "What happened?" "Your youngest son. He collapsed during baseball practice. We're running tests now, but you need to get here." They drove in terrified silence, Melissa navigating through traffic while Kyle's hands shook. He called Kiki repeatedly, getting voicemail, leaving increasingly panicked messages, until finally she called back. "I'm already here," Kiki said, her voice shredded. "They won't tell me anything except that his heart stopped." "Kyle, his heart stopped and they had to resuscitate him." "We're 5 minutes away," Kyle said, his own voice breaking. The emergency room was controlled chaos. Kiki stood in the middle looking destroyed, mascara streaked down her face. When she saw Kyle, she collapsed into him, and he held her automatically, their year of warfare temporarily suspended by shared terror. Kyle's older son sat with Kiki's parents, his young face frozen in shock. When he saw his father, something in him cracked open, and he ran into Kyle's arms, suddenly a little boy again, instead of the angry preteen who'd been punishing his father for months. "Is he going to die?" the boy asked, his voice small. "No," Kyle said with certainty he didn't feel. "The doctors are taking care of him. He's going to be okay." Melissa stayed peripheral, but Kyle reached for her hand, needing the anchor. She took his hand and held it while his family fractured around them. Hours passed in the peculiar time distortion of hospital waiting. The cardiologist finally emerged with controlled gravity. "Your son has a congenital heart defect," the doctor explained, "specifically an anomalous coronary artery. During physical exertion, blood flow became compromised, causing cardiac arrest. If he hadn't been at practice with coaches trained in CPR, the outcome would have been very different." Kyle heard the words, but couldn't process them. His mind stuck on cardiac arrest and different outcome. "What happens now?" Kiki asked. "Surgery," the cardiologist said. "Within the next few days. We need to repair the arterial malformation. The surgery is relatively routine, but all heart surgery carries risks, especially in children." "Can we see him?" Kyle asked. "He's sedated, but yes. One parent at a time initially." Kyle and Kiki looked at each other. "You go," Kyle said. "You were here first." Kiki nodded, following the cardiologist through doors that swung shut behind her. "Dad?" Kyle's older son asked quietly. "Is this my fault? I was mean to you because you left Mom, and now my brother is dying because I was bad." Kyle's heart broke in a completely different way. He pulled his son close. "No, God, no. Your brother being sick has nothing to do with you or me or Mom or anything except genetics. You didn't cause this. But I was so angry at you," the boy said, crying now. "I said I hated you and I wished you weren't my dad." "He's not going to die," Kyle said firmly. "And even if you said those things, it doesn't change that I'm your dad and I love you, and nothing you say or do will ever change that." When Kiki returned, her face was swollen but calmer. "He's awake, asking for you." Kyle went through the doors, unprepared for how small his son looked surrounded by monitors. The boy's eyes opened when Kyle entered. "Am I going to be okay, Dad?" "Yes," Kyle said, sitting carefully beside the bed. "The doctors are going to fix your heart, and then you'll be better than ever." "Will it hurt?" his son asked. "Probably a little," Kyle admitted. "But they'll give you medicine. And I'll be here the whole time, right outside waiting for you." "Will Melissa be here too?" the boy asked, surprising Kyle. "If you want her to be," Kyle said carefully. "I do," his son said. "She's nice." I was mean about her because Mom was sad, but she's actually nice, and she makes you happy. Kyle felt tears finally break free. You don't need to worry about me. You just need to get better. But I want to worry about you, his son insisted, because you're my dad, and I love you even when I'm mad at you. The surgery was scheduled for early morning. Kyle and Kiki signed consent forms that listed risks including death. They sat together in the surgical waiting room, mutual hatred temporarily suspended. I'm sorry, Kiki said suddenly, for everything. For the affair, for the custody battle, for using our sons as weapons. I'm sorry too, Kyle said, for not seeing how unhappy you were, for prioritizing work over connection. You didn't fail me, Kiki said quietly. I failed myself. I made choices that destroyed everything. But sitting here waiting to find out if our son survives makes all of that seem so petty. He'll make it, Kyle said. Melissa arrived with coffee nobody would eat. Kyle's older son finally fell asleep in his grandmother's lap. The surgery took hours. The surgeon emerged looking tired but satisfied. The repair was successful. He's in recovery now. Barring complications, he should make a full recovery. Kyle felt his knees buckle with relief. Kiki made a sound between a laugh and a sob. They held each other for a moment, two people who'd destroyed their marriage, finding brief unity in gratitude. Over the following days, something shifted. Kiki stopped objecting to Melissa's presence, even thanked her for bringing Kyle's older son dinner. Kyle's older son started talking to Melissa, asking about her paintings, gradually remembering that being kind didn't require betraying his mother. One evening, Kiki stopped Melissa in the parking lot. I need to say something, she began. What happened to our families was my fault. Mine and Max's. We destroyed 4 lives with our choices. You didn't cause that. You just refused to let us hide it. I could have handled it differently, Melissa said carefully. Maybe, Kiki agreed. But you were right. If you'd told us privately, I would have denied it. Max would have manipulated it, and Kyle would have spent years doubting himself. The lake house felt cruel, but it was honest. I don't need your forgiveness, Melissa said, but I don't need your hatred anymore either. I'm dropping the custody fight, Kiki continued. Kyle's a good father. We'll do true 50-50 custody. No restrictions. Why now? Melissa asked. Because when I thought I might lose my son, the only person I wanted was Kyle, and he came immediately, and he brought you, and you took care of our other son without being asked. Max didn't come to the hospital. He texted, asking if there was anything he could do, but he didn't show up. I realized I destroyed my marriage for someone who can't even appear when it matters. Kiki walked to her car, and Melissa returned to Kyle, who was buckling his younger son into the back seat. Kiki dropped the custody fight, Melissa told him. Kyle stared in disbelief. She what? Equal custody. No warfare. She's done fighting. Kyle pulled Melissa into his arms, right there in the hospital parking lot. We're going to be okay. All of us, his younger son called from the back seat. Dad, can we get ice cream? The doctor said I could have ice cream. Kyle laughed, the sound breaking free after months of holding everything in. Yes, we can absolutely get ice cream. They drove to the nearest shop, Kyle's boys in the back seat arguing about flavors with casual normalcy. Melissa sat beside Kyle holding his hand and felt something she hadn't felt in years, genuine hope that maybe, finally, the worst was over. At the ice cream shop, Kyle's younger son insisted Melissa choose his flavor, a small gesture of acceptance that meant everything. His older son sat beside her, showing her drawings from school, gradually dismantling the walls he'd built. Melissa looked at this family she'd accidentally become part of, damaged, complicated, healing slowly, and realized that revenge had never been the point. Survival was the point. Truth was the point. Building something real from wreckage was the point. And they were doing it, one moment at a time, one choice of honesty over comfortable lies at a time. Chapter 10. The House That Love Built. Spring arrived with the insistence of something that had waited too long to be born. Melissa stood in Kyle's newly completed house, not the one he'd built for Kiki, but something entirely new, designed specifically for the life he was building now. The architecture reflected lessons learned. Fewer walls, more windows, spaces that encouraged connection instead of performance. Both divorces had been finalized for months. Max's remarriage was already showing cracks, according to mutual acquaintances who still felt compelled to share gossip Melissa no longer needed. She'd heard he was unhappy, that his young wife was exactly like him, ambitious, self-focused, incapable of genuine intimacy. They deserved each other. Kiki had moved across town after selling the house Kyle built, using her share to start therapy and genuinely address why she'd destroyed her marriage. She was dating someone new, a therapist who was helping her unpack patterns she'd been repeating since childhood. The custody arrangement worked remarkably well now that both parents had stopped weaponizing their children. Kyle's sons had adjusted to their new reality, with the resilience of children who'd been given permission to love both parents without guilt. His younger son's heart surgery had been completely successful. The scar on his chest, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. His older son had gradually warmed to Melissa, drawn to her genuine interest in his life and her refusal to compete with his mother. "Do you think they'll actually like me being here permanently?" Melissa asked Kyle as they arranged furniture in the living room. She was moving in today, the final step in making their relationship official. "They already do," Kyle assured her. "You've been basically living here for months anyway. Making it official just means your clothes get closet space instead of living in boxes." Melissa smiled, recognizing truth in his observation. She'd been staying over most nights, cooking meals with Kyle's sons, helping with homework, gradually becoming part of their routine without forcing herself into spaces that weren't hers to claim. The doorbell rang, and Melissa opened it to find a delivery person with the final piece for her new studio space. An easel Kyle had custom-built, incorporating architectural elements into functional art. The gesture spoke his love language, building beauty meant to last. "It's perfect," she told him, running her hands over the smooth wood. "You're perfect," Kyle replied, pulling her close, "or at least perfectly imperfect in ways that fit my imperfections. That's the least romantic declaration ever," Melissa laughed. "Good," Kyle said. "Romance is fantasy. I want real." Real was what they'd built, through custody battles and hospital vigils, through divorce proceedings and painful growth, through learning to trust again after trust had been shattered. It hadn't been beautiful or easy, but it had been honest. That evening, they hosted dinner for everyone who'd survived their respective disasters. Kyle's sons set the table with careful precision their father had taught them. Kiki arrived with her new partner, the first time she'd been to Kyle's house since their divorce finalized. The moment was awkward but necessary, everyone learning to exist in proximity without warfare. "Your home is beautiful," Kiki told Kyle sincerely. "It feels like you, like the kind of space you'd design if you weren't trying to please anyone else." "That's exactly what it is," Kyle agreed. During dinner, conversation flowed with surprising ease. Kyle's younger son told everyone about his baseball team, how he'd been cleared to play again, how his coach had made him team captain. His older son shared news about making the honor roll, about the architecture camp he'd been accepted to for summer. "Following in Dad's footsteps?" Kiki asked warmly. "Maybe," the boy said. "Or maybe I'll design something totally different. But I like building things." "Building things is good," Melissa agreed. "The world needs more people who create instead of destroy." After the boys went to bed, the adults sat in Kyle's living room, 4 people whose lives had been irrevocably intertwined by betrayal and consequence, learning how to be civil in the aftermath. "I want to apologize," Kiki said suddenly, addressing both Kyle and Melissa. "Really apologize, not the performative kind. What I did was inexcusable. I betrayed Kyle. I hurt our children, and I made your life hell, Melissa, because I couldn't face my own guilt. I'm sorry. I accept your apology, Kyle said simply. Not because it erases anything, but because holding on to anger was exhausting, and our sons deserve parents who can be in the same room peacefully. I'm sorry too, Kiki's partner added. I know I'm peripheral to this history, but I want you both to know that Kiki is doing the work. Real therapy, real growth. She's not the person who made those choices anymore. Melissa studied Kiki, seeing someone who'd been broken by her own choices and was slowly rebuilding. I'm glad you're healing, she said honestly. And I'm glad we can do this, be civil, co-parent, exist without constant warfare. The evening ended with surprising warmth, everyone recognizing they'd survived something that could have destroyed them all permanently. As Kiki and her partner left, she hugged Kyle briefly. Thank you for being a good father. Our boys are lucky to have you. After everyone had gone, Melissa and Kyle sat in the quiet house, exhausted but content. We did it, Melissa said. We survived. We did more than survive, Kyle corrected. We built something real from complete wreckage. Months became a year. Melissa's art evolved beyond trauma narratives into work exploring reconstruction and hope. Kyle's firm thrived, his designs becoming more emotionally resonant, as if pain had cracked open his creative vision. They settled into domestic routine that felt miraculous, precisely because it was ordinary. Grocery shopping, school pickups, weekend hikes, the beautiful mundane rhythms of shared life. They married on a spring morning, ceremony small and intimate, held in the shell of Melissa's conservatory with Kyle's sons standing beside him. The vows they wrote themselves spoke of rebuilding, of choosing each other after understanding exactly what that choice cost, of creating truth from the ruins of lies. I promise to show up, Kyle said, in crisis and in calm, in doubt and in certainty. I promise to choose you daily, not because it's easy, but because you're worth every difficult choice. I promise honesty, Melissa replied. Even when truth is uncomfortable, even when lies would be easier, I promise to build our life on foundation of reality instead of fantasy. Kiki attended the wedding, sitting quietly in the back, witnessing her ex-husband marry the woman who'd revealed her betrayal. There was no drama, no scene, just quiet acceptance that this was how their story ended. Not with hatred, but with recognition that everyone had earned their current circumstances. The reception was laughter and music, and Kyle's younger son playing piano. The same child whose medical crisis had forced everyone to remember what actually mattered. As the evening wound down, Melissa caught Kyle's eye across the room and felt overwhelming gratitude for this complicated, imperfect, deeply real life they'd created. Later, in their home, with guests departed and children asleep in their rooms, Kyle and Melissa sat together in the conservatory under glass ceiling that made stars visible. Do you ever think about the lake house? Kyle asked. The moment everything broke open? Sometimes, Melissa admitted. Do you regret how it happened? Kyle considered carefully. I regret the pain it caused my sons. But do I regret knowing the truth, building this life with you? Never. The lake house was brutal, but it was necessary. Sometimes things need to break completely before anything real can be built. I spent so long planning revenge, Melissa said quietly. But revenge was never the point. Reclaiming myself was the point, refusing to let betrayal define me, choosing to build something true. You did that, Kyle said. We both did. They sat in silence, two people who'd survived betrayal by refusing to let it destroy them, who'd built something honest from absolute wreckage, who'd learned that the greatest love stories aren't about never falling, but about choosing to rise together. The house around them stood as testament, walls filled with light, spaces designed for genuine connection, architecture that honored truth over appearance. It wasn't the life either had planned, but it was real in ways their previous marriages never were. I love you, Kyle said, words that had become daily prayer. I love you too, Melissa replied, meaning it with every repaired piece of her heart. Outside, night deepened, but inside everything was illuminated. The story that began with a photograph and exploded at a lake house had transformed into this, ordinary evenings in a home built on honesty, with people who'd learned that being broken open was sometimes the beginning of becoming whole. The next morning, Melissa returned to her conservatory, canvas waiting, brush ready. She began a new painting titled After, not about the betrayal that had ended her first marriage, but about everything that came after, when she realized that being broken open was just the beginning of becoming whole. The most powerful stories weren't about revenge or even forgiveness. They were about the radical act of building something beautiful from what others tried to destroy. With someone who understood that love wasn't about never falling, but about choosing to rise together every single day for the rest of your life. And as morning light flooded through glass walls Kyle had designed specifically for her creativity, Melissa understood that this complicated, imperfect, deeply true life was what happiness actually looked like when you stopped performing it and started living it. The end, and also the beginning.